Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Property Trio podcast. Although today we are a duo, as unfortunately Dave is out of action. So it's a big hello to the duo, I suppose, Cate Bakos.
Yeah. How are you? We haven't
Yeah, I'm
done
doing
this since
well.
Geared for Growth.
Yeah, I know it is a little bit weird, but I think I'm going away soon and I might miss one. So you and Dave get a chance to, be
Duo.
sensible. And yeah, I
Yeah.
tend
And
to
then I'm
derail
going
things.
away. You boys
Yeah.
might do something when I'm away.
Yeah, well, Dave just got back from New Zealand. I'm going to New Zealand because I want to look at mountains. And you're like, well, hold my beer. I'm going to Switzerland to look at mountains. So you win.
Yeah, thanks for that. Taking my girl. It's such a I'm still freaking out just quietly. It's the first time I've walked out of my business for that kind of period of time, which is 2.5 weeks. And it was a easy decision to make 2 years ago when we were talking about what happens when she finishes year 12. But now that it's upon us and it's peak season as well, what was I thinking? But everyone's reminded me you only have a child turn 18 and finish year 12 once. So, yeah, we're going to have a
Yeah,
great
you
one.
look back in 10 years, you definitely will not regret that trip. And I think
No,
sometimes
of
it's good
course.
to think that way. So we've got listener questions today. And yes, we will miss a lot of wisdom from Dave from the property planning point of view, but I think we've got some juicy ones where I'm really, really keen to hear your thoughts. The first one comes from Sheree, not her real name. And she says, my son is in primary school and I'd like to retire around 60 and be in a healthy financial position. So I've got options. My super is currently just over 800K. Should I consider an investment property for my son? If so, where and what? So this is an interesting one because her son is still in primary school. So, I mean, this is definitely kind of thinking well in advance of wanting to sort of help her child get into the property. Let's unpack that. Where do we land on
Yeah.
that? Is it too early for
Well,
someone in primary school?
it's a good question because obviously Sheree could be looking at building her own financial future, but one little thing that you left off, one little detail, is that her super is in defined benefits. Now, that's something that 20 years, 30 years ago you heard a lot of, and defined benefits. You're probably the guy to talk about this, Mike. It's quite different to a managed super fund parcel of shares or whatever, and it's obviously very different to self-managed, but it gives Sheree a certain amount of confidence in her financial future and well-being. Right. It was designed to reward people back in the day for staying in a corporate role for a long, long time or in a position for a long time. It was not just restricted to corporate, but it gives a guaranteed outlook for the retiree. Once they've finished work and they've hung up the gloves, they have a defined amount each year that they live off and until they leave this earth. So it's quite different to super as we know it. And I recall I was working for an organisation that was trying to encourage people to phase out of defined benefits and switch over to the modern version of what we know now. And many people decided to switch, but for those that dug their heels in and didn't, they're quite excited about what their future holds and the fact that they made that decision, because financially for a lot of people it's left them in a more advantageous position. And the reason I say that is Sheree's made that decision or has that benefit, and so she's clearly in a position where she's thinking about her son.
Mm.
And people do think about their kids' financial futures anyway, not just when they've paved their own comfortable financial future, but a lot of people are fearful that their kids won't be able to get a foot on the property ladder. And I think that's a really burning reason why people are avoiding. Sorry, it's a burning reason why people are wanting to help their children get into property. But primary school, it's a pretty young age to be thinking about that, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think so. And I suppose as a primary school kid, you wouldn't be assigning a property into someone's name. I mean, even if you could legally, there's not really the kind of tax advantageous nature of it, because presumably this primary school student doesn't have a job earning $100,000 a year. But I mean, I think we all kind of think about the future that our children are going to occupy, and we can sort of see in the data it's harder to buy a house than it was 20 years ago, and it's probably quite reasonable to think it's not going to get any better. But it sort of begs the question, do you do something with the child in mind immediately, or do you just run your own race, build your own financial future as much as you can, and when the time is right to actually help them, then you've got this war chest to be able to say, okay, well, I'm gonna buy half your property, or I'm going to give you the stamp duty, or I'm going to give you your 20% deposit, or something
Yeah.
like that.
Or I'll pay for your buyer's agent fees, or yeah, the guarantor idea. There's a lot of pathways, and we've talked about this extensively on the show. We've actually had some dedicated episodes to talk about specifically how parents can help their kids. And I know I've talked a lot about how I've helped my stepson and how I plan to help my daughter. So, you know, the resources are there. But in this particular case, I think that it's obviously a purely financial decision to give him a head start and get him a foot on the property ladder, knowing that that property could be sold and something else purchased, or equity could be accessed from that property, or just his overall financial position will be quite strong and enable him to save really effectively. There's lots of ways that this could work positively for him. But there might be another reason why she's looking at purchasing an investment property for her son. And I come across this quite a lot, Mike. People think about where the kid will go to university, or where they might live in the future, or wanting to have them just down the road so that they, you know, partner up and have kids and the family's there to support them. Or it could be that one day the plan is to move in with her son. There's so many different combinations and permutations here, and it would be really interesting to chat with Sheree in person and ask what the motivation is, and whether it's purely a financial decision, or whether there's emotion or, you know, social considerations there as well.
You would assume almost certainly that there is some sort of motivation outside of just the financial. I want to provide for my child, or I want to sort of secure their future. Like, as you say, it might be strategically to be within a certain proximity because she doesn't want him to be too far away when he grows up. Or it could be an educational piece, like, let's sort of buy this together and I can start planting the seed on how to actually invest in property, how to have some financial acumen. But I suppose all we can really do without that information is to sort of remove that. And perhaps if we just attack the topic of, is it a good idea to buy an investment property for her son, rather than, let's say, build her own wealth and do something when he needs it or comes of age? Where do you land on that?
Yeah, it's a very hard one. You know, how much do we spoil our kids? How much do we silver spoon them? How much do we make them work for something and feel that they've got their own sense of achievement? They're all really important questions, and they're personal questions, because not everybody's relationship with their child is the same as the next person. And it just depends on the child's interest in the project and their maturity level and their level of responsibility with money. There are so many considerations here. Something I do want to take us back to, though, is whether Sheree is doing something for herself, or whether she's doing it for her son. As you said, he's in primary school, and if she's looking to retire around 60, we've got to ask some questions about how many more years of work she's got in front of her before she hits retirement. That's something that we don't have information on, because her ability to get a loan and to sustain that while she's working is absolutely in question if she's nearing retirement. And you need to be able to demonstrate what your exit strategy is if that's what you're up to. So the decision might be made for her if it is in question, and she may have to wait until her son is working and earning an income and able to support mortgage repayments. And she might find that it's through a parental loan guarantee that she assists him. There's lots of questions here, Mike.
There is a lot going on, but let's say, assuming she does decide to make that decision, what are some of the considerations that you would have for her?
Yeah, well, the first one is, how does the property become his? Because at this stage, while he's in primary school, his name can't go on a title. So it will either be in her name or she might need to have a family trust set up. If it goes into her name, she will trigger stamp duty to turn it over to him at a later date. And at this stage, he can't be a joint purchaser because he's too young. So getting that advice is really important. What's the entity? What's the future look like? How does she protect that asset as well? How does she make sure that she's not doing this for his well-being and he gets to a certain age and maybe he's irresponsible with money, or maybe he partners up and things don't go well and then he loses half of his asset. I mean, these are all of the considerations that a parent will be thinking when they're wanting to help their child, because they're not thinking about their primary school son's future girlfriend or wife or partner. They're actually just thinking about how they can help their son. So first and foremost, getting some advice on how this is set up and how things are protected. And then we've also got to think about what sort of spend she's considering and what sort of returns she needs to manage, because this property will most likely cost her some out-of-pocket contributions unless she's getting a positive cash flow property, which will then usually have limited growth prospects. She'll have to work out how much she can afford, how much she can sustain to hold this property. And as we both know, in the early years of ownership, that's when properties are at their most expensive. It's as the rent grows that the cash flow starts to get a little easier.
Yeah, and I suppose just by the inflation effect, the value of that debt gets devalued over time. But I mean, we've got a pretty obvious time horizon here. Primary school kid can't really be any older than 12, I assume. So, really we've kind of got to be holding on to this property for, at least sort of 6 or 8 years, and quite possibly quite a bit more. So the last situation you want to be in is where, okay, we don't understand the holding costs, or we're in a position where it's hard and we can't really, maybe access the equity because you've sort of siloed this off for your son. But as you say, like, just the sheer kind of strategy around her and her retirement might influence the mortgage decision, and just on the structuring and how that is all kind of set up. Once you get the advice on those two things, it might actually make the decision for her, do you think?
I think so. I think you've nailed it, Mike. And you talked about understanding the cash flows. This is really important if she's gifting this property over to him at a certain age, because if he's not in a position to sustain negative cash flow, and let's say he is 12 and she wants to give it to him at 18, in 6 years' time, this property might still be negative cash flow. So you've really got to plan ahead. What type of present or gift are you wanting to give over when the time comes? Because if you're expecting your child to then take on that debt or manage that property, you want to make sure that the out of pockets, if they're there, are manageable and in line with what your child will appreciate. Because if you're giving them something that's heavily cash flow negative, they might feel like they've got a hot potato.
And then, the end of the question is, if so, where and what? And it sort of begs the question, well, what is something that is safe in terms of that time horizon? And you don't want to be gifting something over to a young adult who's maybe at university and not bringing in an income, or they're just starting their career and they can't really afford $100 a week negative cash flow. So, defining the question of firstly, what is safe to satisfy that, and then the where and the what. That's quite a big one.
It is indeed. Safe, there's a couple of things that I think about when I consider safe. You don't want to buy in a volatile area where this property loses value and is a disappointment. And you don't want to purchase where you've got vacancy issues, which is not really a conversation topic that we have to worry about in this day and age, because vacancy rates are so tight in so many locations around Australia, but it's a real consideration. And then you've got to also think about the maintenance costs and the age of the property. If it's a strata property, is it likely to deteriorate and then have special levies that will be quite high, or maintenance things that are popping up and stressing your son out? So these are definitely considerations that are important when you're considering where you can pop your money now to create something that will be a fantastic nest egg as opposed to a burden.
So in summary, I guess the advice that she would need is, firstly, to figure out, well, is she on track for the retirement that she wants to have? Obviously, having those super benefits is an amazing position that she's in there, but needs to figure that out and make sure that that's not going to be, I suppose, set back by any decision to do something with her son. And then so getting the mortgage advice, getting the accountant's advice on, well, how do we actually structure this and how do we trigger the transfer in the most tax effective way? And then, of course, a property planner like Dave can sort of model all the different things. But I think it will come down to the advice that comes from an accountant and a broker that will probably answer this question of which way she goes, right?
Yeah, I agree. And obviously, a buyer's agent will lean in and let her know what sort of asset or what sort of dwelling, whereabouts it is, and what sort of returns they can anticipate. But yeah, I think you've nailed it. It's all about getting the right advice first.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the question, Sheree, and hopefully you have the right people that can give you that advice. And we wish you all the best. And I think it's wonderful that you're looking at doing something like that for your son. He's a very lucky primary school kid indeed. Let's talk to Chloe, who, again, not her real name. She's got a question here. She says, I'm a would-be first-time property investor. My question is about planning. I've worked out maximum borrowing, current household surplus, and I have an idea of approximate maximum negative cash flow with some buffers that she can maintain. We want to buy a growth asset and to work with a local expert buyer's agent. These variables should be enough to narrow down where to invest, but I can't work out how to do it. Local expert buyer's agents are often not connected to businesses that look across all of Australia. So, I mean, firstly, chapeau to Chloe for doing that amount of research and having that amount of sophistication before she's pulling the trigger. In my experience, that's relatively uncommon.
Yeah, it is uncommon. And for her to have worked out maximum borrowing capacity, she might have gone to the bank, she could have done an online calculation, or she might have consulted with the mortgage broker. So knowing that information is great. What I would encourage Chloe to think about if she hasn't done this is to take it one step further and think about what she wants out of her property investment. Are we talking about a portfolio and multiple properties, or are we just talking about one property? And maybe Chloe has other asset classes that she's considering and she's just wanting to diversify. But whatever it is, always asking you why. Why am I investing? What do I want out of it? And then what's my time frame? What sort of retirement income do I want to derive from property? And then what's my strategy? Is it buy and hold, or am I amassing a capital growth property or two and doing divesting when I get to retirement and putting the funds into something else? They're really big questions, but when you get them right at the start, it really paves the way for you to have a good strategy going forward. So that would be my first point for Chloe. She's done all of this hard work for this one property, but what does that mean for other properties? Because if you max out your borrowing capacity on property number one and you have an intention to have more than one property, you might find yourself feeling really frustrated that you didn't consider that first.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think she's got to understand where she wants to get to. Like I like to say, you can have your dessert, but you got to eat your veggies, and the veggies is, okay, well, I want X amount of passive income at this point, or I want this amount of unencumbered assets by retirement age. So once she's kind of done that, then the question is really about, a growth property. Mm-hmm. And of course, you've got to sort of figure out how that sits within the portfolio. And I think that's a great strategy for the first one to be a growth one. It's hard because if it doesn't grow and that's the kind of the plan that you're going for, then you might have to be patient to be able to pull equity to go in to the next one. And then, of course, there's a broader question about a buyer's agent, which I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on it. But as for the first investment property, do you see, something that, of course, you can manage negative cash flow, but do you see growth as the real launching pad to growing a multi-portfolio property?
I do indeed. And it feels really uncomfortable for a new investor sometimes to go for a growth-focused asset at the very beginning. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Usually you might be younger and you're on a lower income, or it could be at a time in your life when you've got little kids and all of your expenses are biting, and that you're very conscious of your out of pockets, and a growth asset generally has higher out of pockets. It could just be that you're really nervous about investment. You want to take a baby step first. But if you can do the growth asset first, it absolutely paves the way for you, because you're getting something that's delivering a higher percentage growth than a balanced or a cash flow asset. And it's that equity growth that helps you springboard into the next property and the next one. So if you're giving yourself the longest period of time with the growth asset, you will do better in the long run. So it is always a more difficult concept for people when they're getting started for all of those reasons I stated, but it is absolutely the way to go if you can. My concern about Chloe, though, and this question, it was her last paragraph that got me thinking, oh, okay, because a local buyer's agent isn't often connected to a business that looks across all of Australia. There are a few businesses that look nationwide. I personally think a locally based buyer's agent who knows their market really well and knows all of the streets and the agents and all of those little details that a national buyer's agent might not know, I think will give someone an edge. And that's just my opinion, but I see what some interstate BAs do when they come into my patch. They don't understand the intricacies of an area. They might buy in a street that isn't so good, or they might not understand something that could have a negative impact on the property. So I digress. Chloe's question has me thinking that what she's looking for is the perfect location and the perfect street and the perfect property. And you and I both know, Mike, that there's no such thing as a perfect property. Property are like people, and there's no such thing as a perfect person. So what is Chloe looking for? Because if she's looking for that 100%, holy grail property, I'm concerned that she's looking so micro and actually not macro. The macro view of this question for me is what do you want your entire property portfolio outlook to be? When do you want to retire? What do you want to enjoy in retirement that's derived from property? How many properties ideally do you need? What sort of broad returns are we looking for? There's nothing broad about Chloe's question other than the fact that she wants to have a very broad catchment that she's considering.
Yeah.
And this could be a signal that analysis paralysis is striking, maybe. What concerns me is relying on one buyer's agent to determine the perfect place in Australia and the perfect dwelling type to go for. And we're talking about a growth asset. I don't think there's a single person who could nail it right down to the suburb and say, over the next 10 years or 20 years, this particular asset is going to outperform the rest of Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it is all crystal ball to some degree. I mean, you and I have sort of spoken about certain advertisements where people are saying, first year growth 14.2%. I'm like, well, you can model things to the point where it'll give you decimal places, but you change the variables and the assumptions, it blows out wildly. So, it doesn't exist to have this perfect idea of this is the exact property in Australia. But I'm guessing like she is onto something with these variables should be enough to narrow it down where to invest. I mean, once she sort of figures out, well, what she's trying to achieve, what her income is, where she's likely to be tapped out, so she hits her head against the sort of the finance game and that sort of stops her, that will sort of say, okay, well, it's got to be something with growth potential that maybe eliminates some markets. It has to be something with a yield that's manageable, and that'll eliminate some markets. And it'll also have to be at a price point. And if that price point is, say, sub 650,000, that will kind of narrow it all down. But it's still quite likely that there's still a broad search that she could be looking at. I mean, you could be looking at somewhere in Adelaide or somewhere like Townsville or Toowoomba. It's not going to just be like, okay, well, it has to be in Geelong within 10 k's of the CBD. It's not going to get a result like that, surely.
Yeah, you've absolutely nailed it. There are multiple cities, multiple suburbs, multiple streets nationally that could get great results for Chloe. And the thing is, we can often, not necessarily me and you, but I pride myself on recognizing areas that will do something in the shorter term. And there are some fabulous property analysts out there who have identified markets where a short to medium term burst of activity and growth is possible. But we're talking about a long-term strategy here, and it's very hard to say over the next 20-year period, I think this location will outperform. I think a good advisor would have a combination of areas that have really attractive growth drivers and a basis for anticipating some extraordinary growth. But there are things that we can't predict. There are policies that are created. There's legislation that's introduced. There are business decisions that are made. And then there are global events. And of course, throw in a pandemic. Who knows what's going on? My point is that long term, I think focusing on someone that can give you just one magical area could be dangerous because it might cost you time in a moving market if you're trying to finesse this. And that's my biggest concern.
And I suppose once she sort of narrows it down to the brief, you're still looking at a number of different areas across the country, I would say, that are all viable candidates. And it begs the question, is it better for her to perhaps work with a strategist that then says, okay, well, this one we think has got the best prospects, and then find a local BA to transact in that location? Or could she work with someone that, like yourself, that might help to do the analysis and kind of oversee it? But I'm presuming, let's say it is in Townsville, you would recommend someone that you know to be a good local in that area? Or is it a matter of if you're not doing the actual deal, typically people wouldn't work with you?
It is a tough question because I would be loath to talk to someone about investing outside of Victoria, not because I think that Victoria is the best place to invest right now.
Certainly not now.
It's actually because of my license. You know, my
Right.
experience is in Vic. My license is Victorian. And I think getting good advice from either a property planner or a strategist and managing a diverse portfolio and focusing on the long-term outlook is really important. But there are other considerations that Chloe has to think about. What sort of maintenance is she up for? And, you know, how readily available could she be if she needed to be hands-on, or is she happy to outsource all of that? How much does she want to travel to see the property? Does she care about seeing the property? I mean, some agnostic investors don't. But these are all really important because if the area that's determined for Chloe is, let's say, in WA and she's on the East Coast, well, does that really suit her? Does it suit her sense of commitment to the property and a risk profile? There are quite a few questions to ask here. I think what would be really handy, though, is to step back, have a look, a macro look at all of this, and decide how long this buy and hold is going to be for. If it's really short term, that might be easier to pick areas that will do well and then you're divesting them. But that starts to enter into the trading space, trading in property, and it's not something that I support. It's an expensive pastime when you consider the trading costs in this asset class.
So would you recommend, say, doing all of that work to say, here's what I want to achieve with the portfolio, here is kind of my roadmap, property one would need to look like this, property two would need to look like this, and perhaps take that to a nationally focused buyer's agent to say, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what I've mapped out and I've modeled, and she could have some success there? Or in your experience, do these national BAs just sort of say, oh, we just buy in, you know, Adelaide right now because it's got the best fundamentals, or Perth? Or will they take what she's mapped out and planned and go, all right, well, let's start looking for property one that fits that?
It's a good question. Not all national focused BA businesses are the same. There are some good ones and there are some terrible ones. I think finding a strategist that is prepared to tell you what your strategy should look like, where you should be heading, what sort of growth and yield metrics you're going after, and what the timing should look like, and then giving you the option to either use someone in their firm or to go out to market yourself. That rests way more comfortably with me, Mike. Recognizing when you're dealing with a business that is prepared to give you that holistic advice and that information about where to invest, when to invest, what the metrics look like, the growth, the yield, and not necessarily tying that up with enforcing use of their own buyer's agent. It gives me a much better feeling because you're paying for the advice then. It's independent. They're not getting something else out of it. Obviously, if you like their team and they've got a capable buyer's agent, that's great. But if you're going with someone who isn't necessarily taking all of your personal situation into account and they're just canvassing a particular area because that's the hot area right now, that makes me feel pretty uncomfortable. So do your research. If you're looking at a national firm, read their reviews, understand exactly how the business systems operate and what your journey will look like as a buyer, and certainly do your homework.
I want to ask you just one little extension on that. She mentions the word local expert a number of times, and I feel like there's three ways this is done. There's the local expert that literally has their boots on the ground, and not just the boots on the ground, but when you go home, your boots stay in your house, whereas other boots can be flown to different locations. So that's two different ways to look at it. There's also the ones that have a national focus, but they might not physically have an employee inspect the property. They might use a trusted property manager, or they might use some outsourced person to do a walkthrough. Yeah. Where do you sort of land on that?
I don't like that. I really don't. I want to think that an advocate or a buyer's agent is familiar with the area and the streets and all of the attributes, positive and negative, that could impact the property's performance. I worry about situations where, AI or a system is selecting a property, or someone's just sitting on their laptop in another state and then getting a property manager or a building inspector to run through. They're employed to recognise the good, the bad, the ugly, and to think about all of the growth drivers, to think about the rental yield, to think about lots of different facets, whereas a property manager won't necessarily be going in there thinking about capital growth. In fact, I had this hilarious conversation many, many years ago with a dear property manager that I do a lot of, we share a lot of clients, and I do a lot of work with her in Ballarat. And sometimes I'd give her my selection, my short list after having a big day out in the field in Ballarat. And she'd nitpick the properties that I've picked up because I'm looking for capital growth. And she's just looking for something that's polished and ready for a tenant and razzle-dazzle internally, and something that will deliver a really good rent and give her limited grief. It might not be as well located, or it might not have the lovely historic attributes and all of the heritage appeal of the properties that I pick up. And so you have to meet in the middle and understand what a property manager is looking at as well. But if you've just got the input of one person, building inspector or property manager, who's looking at the dwelling and not necessarily the location or the area, that's when you've got warning bells in my mind.
That's a really, really valuable point, I think, because that property manager's like, I'm looking for something that's going to rent easy, that I know there's demand for, and I don't really want headaches. So they might be skewed to a newer property or a newly renovated property because they don't want to deal with issues. But you're sort of like, well, we pay a property manager to navigate those issues. So finding the property that's going to grow by an extra 0.5% per year is worth stomaching some of those issues. But those two viewpoints don't align perfectly, and somewhere in the middle maybe is the answer.
Yeah, I think so. Or just making sure that your BA is mindful of both sets of priorities, the capital growth and also, the ease of renting it out and maintaining a happy tenancy and not having headache.
Well, Chloe, I hope that does give you something to work with, and thank you for your question, and to Sheree as well. Now we'll go to some gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
Parents who want to help their kids, I think, that comes up time again, and I love this idea, but it's really important to think about what it is that you're wanting to help them with. Are you potentially stealing their thunder, or are you getting them a property, gifting it to them and hoping that they might live in it one day and it's actually not where they want to be? You've always got to think, when you're doing something generous, is it a gift or is it a burden? I think I'll just leave it on that note.
I think that's a good one. And I suppose what comes out in two of them is that if you go down the path of the strategy, then often it might just give you the one pathway that you need to go, or at the very least, there's an unlimited amount of possibilities and directions that you can go. But the more work that you do from a planning point of view, the more it actually helps you to narrow that down. And it might be the situation that Sheree maybe just has two viable options. So doing that work on what you're actually trying to achieve with property, with your own retirement or your passive income down the track, it's such a worthwhile exercise, because otherwise it's really difficult to reverse engineer, and you can go down the wrong direction that can set you back in time frame or financially. So definitely you need to work with a strategic planner on those sorts of things. Well, that was the episode, and
we missed our third musketeer.
We missed Dave, but hopefully we still could have put a good one together, and Sheree and Chloe got something out of that. And please keep sending your questions through. We can't get to them all, but we love to unpack the ones that we can. And we really are privileged to be able to help out wherever we can. So thanks a lot. Keep them coming through, and we'll see you next week, Kate.
See you next week.